Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time you're watching this. It's a pleasure to have you here in Sunday school at Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church. And we look forward to the day when we'll be able to meet together again in Sunday school and enjoy the company of one another and sit close together and all those things that we haven't been able to do in more than a year. Today, we want to look at the book of Philippians. Remember that 2 weeks ago we looked at Galatians. Last week we looked at Ephesians, and so this week we look at Philippians, another one of the prison epistles or the prison letters, so called because Paul wrote them while he was in prison, so it's called a prison epistle. This is one of the most personal of all Paul's letters, probably the most personal with the exception of Philemon, which is a very, very personal letter, as you'll see when we get to it. Philemon is, in essence, the kind of thing that we think of when we think of a letter. So we'll wait until we get to Philemon to talk more about that. But today, we want to think about this book of Philippians and what it means to us and what it has to say to us. Here's the drawing of the book of Philippians. There's a bull who's flipping ends, so Philippians. Its key word is humble. So you see that the bull is humming while he flips these ends. Paul was humble, happily humble, as he wrote to the prison from the Philippian church. If the church of Jesus Christ is going to endure difficult times, it stands to reason that the leaders should be the examples. Not the examples of what not to do, but the examples of what ought to be done. So Paul is chained in prison, and yet he's having a humbling experience, but he's still happy. He's still joyful in adverse circumstances. And so joy in adverse circumstances is the theme of this book. And Paul urges believers to focus on Christ because he's the true life, he says in chapter 1, verse 21. And he urges them not to be anxious, not to worry about things, but to live in peace and harmony with other people and to have the mind of Christ through all of that suffering. So, who wrote the book? It's safe to say that the vast majority of those who study the New Testament today will say that Paul is responsible for writing the book of Philippians. Not everyone, but the vast, vast majority. This is not like Ephesians. It's certainly not like what we will get to when we get to the pastoral epistles, where very few think that Paul wrote them. This is a very simple and it's in Paul's style. It's very clear. No one denies that Paul wrote it. And so the theme could be that Paul rejoices in his partnership with the Philippians in the midst of adversity. That is that there's no sense in which the fact that we're facing troubles in our life or difficulties in our life or whatever the case may be ought to cause us to give up our Christianity or to lose hope. We face difficulties in our life, all of us, Christians and non-Christians. And yet the Christians know that in the midst of adversity, we still have the Lord to help us and bless us. Here's a quick outline of the book. There's an introduction in the first chapter in Paul's report to the people. There are exhortations to true unity, the end of chapter 1 all through chapter 2. Then in chapter 3, Paul warns against false teachers, as was so common and is so common in the Pauline epistles. There were always those who were going around teaching false things, and Paul needs to warn against them. And then finally in the 4th chapter, he exhorts us and points us toward thanksgiving. So let's think then about this city of Philippi. What kind of a city was it? Philippi was already a very old and historic city when Paul visited there. He visited on his second missionary journey, and it had been there for quite some time. And remember that Paul came to Philippi as a result of the vision that he had while he was in Troas. And so here you will see what's going on. There's Philippi in Macedonia. Macedonia is sort of north of Greece, as you can see. Greece is down here. There's Corinth, the Corinthian isthmus. So Philippi is up here. And Paul wants to write this particular letter to make sure that the Philippians know that he loves them, that God loves them, and that regardless of what kind of difficulties they are facing, that he is still in control. So let's look at some critical questions about the book. And by critical questions, I mean the kind of questions that critical scholars ask, or that any scholar asks, really, and as they read through the book of Philippians. I hope that you will read through the book, because it doesn't take long. It take you half an hour, 40 minutes, or something like that, to read through the book of Philippians. And it's a book about joy. If you're looking for joy, you're looking for good, wonderful things in your life, then Philippians is a book that I would choose. It's a book that I would choose to read and to put into my life. So let's look at a few of these questions. The biggest question about the book of Philippians in terms of the critical questions is not the audience, it's not the author, it's the unity of the letter. Remember that when we talked about 2 Corinthians, we talked about the fact that there were some seams in the letter. That is, places where the letter seems to end and then it goes on off on something else. There are seams there in this book of Philippians. And so some have argued that this is not one letter that Paul wrote, but it's two and usually three, they will argue, that have been sort of stitched together to make a longer letter. And there are a variety of arguments against the unity. Let me give you just a few of them. One is that Paul seems to prepare for a conclusion in chapter 3 and verse 1. Now, that might seem problematic, but we've all known people, and perhaps preachers are the worst, who say, let me just finish up, and then they go on for another half an hour. And this could very well be what Paul is doing, preparing for a conclusion and yet going on. A second argument against unity is that there's a radical change of tone starting at chapter 3 and verse 2. So Paul's preparing for a conclusion in 3:1, then there's this radical change of tone. And some have argued that if you go from 3:1, skip through the book, and then go to 4:4, so you bring chapter 4 and verse 4 up against 3:1, it fits very well and very easily. And another argument is that Paul waits until the very end of the letter to thank the Philippians for their gift to him. Why wouldn't he have made that thank you up front to let them know that he really did appreciate this? None of these arguments are insurmountable. Some of them are not even very good, I think, but you at least get the sense now. But what about arguments in favor of unity? This is the place where I find myself. I think that Philippians is a unified book. It was probably written over more than one sitting, but first, the disjointedness of the letter shouldn't be that surprising given how personal the writing is. We've all gotten letters back in the day when people used to write letters, and we get emails today, sometimes from people who seem like they're going from one subject to another, to another, to another, without tying them together. It's just not that unusual. It's a personal style of writing. And a second piece of evidence, and one that I find very compelling in favor of unity, is that there's not one single manuscript that suggests the fact that Philippians ever existed in any other form. And by that I mean we don't get a manuscript of the book of Philippians that only has up through chapter 3, or that doesn't have 3:2 through 4:3. We don't get that, and that seems to me a very strong piece of evidence. A third piece of evidence in favor of the strength is that the same terms, the same motifs, the same sort of things that are being said pervade the entire letter. So if this were really three letters, you wouldn't expect the same motifs to sort of go through all three of them, and yet that's what happens. And the development of Paul's argument in one part of the letter often depends on what he has said in another part of the letter. For example, look at chapter 2 and verses 6 through 11 and compare that with chapter 3, verses 7 through 11, and you'll find, even when you look at 3:20 through 21, you'll find that they're dependent upon what has come before them. As a result of that, it seems to me that a fair analysis of the book of Philippians would at least leave room for the fact that this is all one particular letter that was written by one person. There's no compelling reason to doubt that Philippians came from the pen of Paul and that he wrote it in a single letter. Let's then think about the place of writing. Now, as opposed to the place of receipt, that is Philippi, that we saw on the map, it's harder to tell exactly where Paul wrote this book from, because he doesn't really tell us. There are a few things that we know about the apostle and about this book that will help us to understand. Here are some known factors. One, Paul is in prison. In chapter 1, verse 7, chapter 1, verse 13, Paul very clearly says that he's in prison. Number two, Paul faced a trial that could end in his death. In chapter 1, verses 19 and 20, and chapter 2, verse 17, it's very clear that Paul is saying, this could be the end of me. This trial could be the end of me. Third, there was a praetorium where he was held. That is a group of Roman guards there where he was held. And so wherever he was held needs to be a place where there was a praetorium. And fourthly, Timothy was with Paul. We see that in 1:1. We see that in 2:19. So these are things that we know, and then we have to try and determine for ourselves, well, how do we get to those places? There were evangelistic efforts that were going on all around him. You see that in 1:14 through 17. There are a lot of people who are telling about the good news of Jesus Christ. And finally, we learn in chapter 2 and verse 24 that Paul had decided that he wanted to visit Philippi when he was finally out of jail and when he was acquitted from this trial. So given all of that we know, where is it that Paul is writing from? There are three places that are proposed that Paul might be writing from. One of them is Rome. Rome meets most of the above criteria that we've talked about, these known factors. It's the oldest and it's the most widely held view. It's not without its problems, otherwise there wouldn't be two other alternatives, but it's at least, it's a good idea, and it's a possibility that Paul was imprisoned in Rome facing trial right before he wrote this book. Another idea, and this is from modern scholarship, the ancient church believed it was Rome. Modern scholarship suggests that it was Ephesus. and the prison at Ephesus where Paul wrote this letter. This view is also not without its problems. And then the third idea is Caesarea. And so the objections are more serious here, but not enough, I think, to totally eliminate Caesarea from consideration. And so there's no possibility for us to know exactly and without any question where the book was written from, but the introduction by D.A. Carson and Doug Moo lean toward Ephesus. The dictionary of Paul and his letters in their article on Philippi lean toward Caesarea. The early church leaned toward Rome. So again, it depends. You can do some work on this by reading a New Testament introduction on the book of Philippians, or getting a commentary on the book of Philippians and reading what they have to say about from where the book came. So what is this book of Philippians really about? We've looked at these proposed places of writing: Rome, Ephesus, Caesarea, and we have decided that we just don't know for certain from where it was written. And so we have to ask the question about the opponents in Philippi. Who were these people that were opposing Paul? Realize that in virtually every letter, not every letter, but virtually every letter, Paul has to speak about some opponents that are teaching false things. And it's unlikely that these are a single group, but there are probably several groups. One of the groups opposed Paul himself. These were fellow Christians. Paul calls them brothers in 1:14 and 15. They may have been Judaizers. Remember the term Judaizers from the book of Galatians. The Judaizers taught that you not only needed faith in Christ, but you need to become Jewish by keeping the law. So as a result of that, Paul says, no, you don't need to keep the law. And there's some tension, obviously, there. The second group probably were different. They had apparently threatened the Philippians physically and were trying to undermine the gospel while they were getting the Philippians to give up their belief. It's these people that Paul calls dogs, evil workers, mutilators in chapter 3 and verse 2. The term mutilators probably comes because of the fact that they were forcing the Philippians to be circumcised, even though they didn't need to become a Christian. So Paul calls them mutilators and enemies of the cross in 3:18. These may have been Jewish missionaries. So they may not have even been Christians. They may have been just going around trying to get people to become Jewish by following the Jewish law. And that would have been particularly problematic for Paul, given the fact that he was worshiping the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah. So there are a variety of things to consider here. If you'd like to learn more about Jewish missionaries, right after the time of Christ, during the time of Paul, there's a book called A Light Among the Gentiles by Scott McKnight that is wonderful in that area, the area of Jewish missionaries and what they did. So let's think a little bit now about some of the important themes in the book of Philippians. As we read through the book of Philippians, what is it that we are really supposed to be getting? What is it that we're really supposed to be looking for to impact our life and to change us in one way or another? First, there's Christology. There's a Christ hymn in chapter 2, verses 6 through 11. And this Christ hymn, so called because many think that it was already a hymn before Paul wrote it down, that he heard it or obtained it somewhere. But it's It's Paul's teaching about the person and work and nature of Jesus Christ. That Christ took upon himself the form of a slave or a servant. The idea of slavery is really a crucial one to the understanding of the New Testament. It's really important to remember that many New Testament scholars argue that it's wrong to translate the word that in some versions is translated servant as servant. They argue that it should be translated slave, and that despite the distaste that slave leaves in our mouth, primarily because of American slavery that caused the Civil War, or at least contributed to the Civil War, that was an evil and wicked kind of slavery. And yet the slavery that existed in the New Testament is very, very different from the slavery that existed during this time. The best book on slavery is a book called Slavery as a Metaphor for Christ. It's written by Murray Harris. It's a fairly technical book, but it basically brings together all kinds of threads about slavery in the first century and what would have happened to a slave. Notice that in 1:1, Paul calls himself a slave of Christ. And so by implication, all of us are to be slaves of Christ. All of us are to be the kind of people who are thankful that we have a master who is kind and gracious and wonderful. Now, notice, of course, that it's important that when we use the term slavery, we're very careful with it, given the kind of background that it has in our country, the kind of racial slavery. Keep in mind that the slavery of the ancient world was not racially motivated. It was, one could become a slave in a variety of ways, and we'll talk about that when we get to Philemon, who was a slave. And we'll ask the question, why doesn't Paul just out and out say, slavery is wrong, why don't you get rid of it? Rather than calling himself a slave of Christ. A very interesting question, and one that we'll think about when we get to the book of Philemon. Christ himself, though, affords the model that the slaves are supposed to follow. That we are to do all that we can to give up ourselves and follow after that one who gave himself for us, that one Jesus. A slave's obedience is unquestioning, it's complete, and the terms of our obedience to Christ are not negotiable. It's not as if we could sing, Lord, take my life and let it be, let me be. How about that? Take my life and let me be. There's nothing like that. Unlike military system found in some countries, there's no selective service in Christianity. All of us are called to be slaves of Christ, slaves of the Father. We are to spend our life doing what He has called us to do. And that's a very significant point. And as you read through both the Pauline epistles and the other epistles, James, for example, or Jude, you will find them calling themselves slaves of Jesus Christ. And so that ought to cause us to at least think through what it means to be a slave and how slavery is different in the Bible from the kind of slavery that we're sort of familiar with. What can't be denied is Paul is urging sort of an experience of humility. Paul is saying we are all slaves of Christ, and therefore we turn our life over to Him, not to anyone else. Then there's a second theme, and that is the theme of joy. This theme of joy runs throughout the book. The noun joy occurs 5 times in these 4 chapters, And the verb to rejoice occurs 9 times in this short letter. So just by looking at the words, we can begin to see what's going on. And one of the questions that we might ask is, what is joy? And this book seems to teach us that joy is not so much a feeling, like I feel joyful today, but I might not tomorrow. It's not that. It's a settled state of mind, sort of characterized by peace. We are joyful because we view life both in its ups and in its downs and in all of that as with peacefulness, knowing that whatever comes toward us, God is still in charge. God is still in charge today, just as he was in charge back when Paul was writing this letter. And so, given that, Paul exhibits this joy in his own life. This letter is a comparatively rare thing for Paul. In fact, almost certainly a very rare thing. It's a letter to a church with which Paul is pleased. He doesn't say, stop doing this or stop doing that or stop doing the other thing like he does in Corinth and Galatians. He says, who has bewitched you? All kinds of problems. Yet here, it's clear that Paul has a personal stake in this letter and in this church. And it's clear that Paul loves these people very dearly. And he wants to make sure that they follow the gospel. And they have so far, and he's pleased with them. There aren't many letters written by the apostle where he is very pleased with what the church has done. This is one of them. So read it. Read it carefully. Let it soak into you and listen to what the text has to say about being joyful. Let me end with a slide that will remind us of what Paul tells us we should be thinking about in the book of Philippians. He says, these are the things we should be thinking about. Finally, brothers and sisters, here it says brothers, but it can be just as easily and rightly translated as brothers and sisters. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Those are the sort of things that will make you joyful. Those are the sort of things that will be helpful to you. Those are the sort of things that you will be glad that you have thought about during this time when so many people are trapped inside their houses or can't go where they want to go, can't see whom they want to see, and it's difficult for us. It causes some sense of loss and sometimes depression. When you face the lack of joy in your own life, I would urge you to pick up this letter to the Philippians and read about the joy that the apostle has despite the fact that he's in prison. Read about the joy that we ought to have despite the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic, and go through our lives with the realization that joy is not just a feeling of happiness. Joy is the knowledge that we're in good hands, that no matter how bad the pandemic gets, no matter how difficult things are, we are in the hands of our God, and He indeed will take care of us in a great and special way. I hope that this has been a blessing for you. I hope that the Lord will continue to bless you as we do our flyover through these few remaining books of the New Testament. I'm really hoping that this will be a great and wonderful time as we go through the rest of Paul's letters and all the way to the book of Revelation. It's then that we will have covered every book of the Bible. Not covered it in any sense of depth, but we've given you a sort of a handle that you can go in and start reading and understand what's going on. So I hope this is a blessing to you, and I'll see you next time here at Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church Sunday School. May the Lord bless you greatly.